Okay, so today's story is about one of those creepy urban legends that, for a long time, people thought was just make-believe, until it turned out to be horrifyingly real. It was the evening of July 9th, 1987, when 12-year-old Jennifer Schweiger was walking alone along a quiet Staten Island street. Jennifer had Down syndrome, but she was independent, curious, and loved being outside. Her adoptive parents told her to be home before the sun went down, but that night, she didn't come back. At first, it seemed like the kind of missing child case Staten Island police had sadly seen before. Officers knocked on doors, volunteers searched through wooded areas, and missing posters started popping up on telephone poles. But then the whispers began. People weren't saying Cropsey, not yet anyway, but they were talking about a man who seemed to live in the shadows of the abandoned Willowbrook State School, Andre Rand. Rand wasn't some random stranger who'd blown into town. He'd been in Staten Island for years. Born Frank Rushan in 1944, he'd once worked as a custodian at Willowbrook back in the 60s, when the school was still running and notorious for being overcrowded, filthy and abusive. In fact, Rand's name first landed in police records in a serious way in 1969, when he was caught luring a 9-year-old girl into his car and trying to assault her. Rand ended up serving 16 months in prison for sexual abuse. When he got out, his life was a mix of odd jobs, small-time arrests, and long stretches spent camping out in the woods or squatting in abandoned buildings. By the early 80s, though, his behaviour was getting, well, a lot weirder. One year, he actually picked up a bus full of 11 kids from a Staten Island YMCA, without telling anyone, drove them all the way to Newark Airport, hung out there for a few hours, and then just brought them back. His explanation? Just for fun. He got 10 months in jail for unlawful imprisonment. That alone would have been enough to make anyone side-eye him forever, but it gets darker. Since the early 1970s, kids had been disappearing around Staten Island, and in more than a few of those cases, Rand's name kept popping up. In 1972, 5-year-old Alice Pereira vanished from the lobby of her apartment building. People remembered seeing Rand in the area that day. She was never found. In 1981, 7-year-old Hollyanne Hughes went to the store to buy soap and never made it back. Neighbours swore they saw Rand's green Volkswagen creeping around the block that day. In 1983, 10-year-old Tia Heese Jackson walked out of a motel where her family was staying and didn't come back. Rand at the time was living in a graveyard nearby. Then, in 1984, 22-year-old Hank Gaforio, who was mentally disabled and had the mind of a child, left a diner with Rand. He was never seen again. In every single one of these cases, police suspected Rand, and in every single one they couldn't prove anything. But when 12-year-old Jennifer Schweiger disappeared in 1987, something felt different. People had seen Rand walking hand in hand with her just hours before she vanished, and at the time, he was living in a little makeshift camp on the overgrown abandoned grounds of Willowbrook. Police picked Rand up for questioning, and of course, he denied everything. But just a week later, search volunteers made a grim discovery, a shallow grave hidden in the woods behind Willowbrook. Inside was Jennifer's body. The whole community was shaken. And now, the whispers weren't just about Andre Rand. They were about Cropsey. People started saying the legend had been real all along, and that he'd finally been caught. Rand's trial started in 1988. The prosecution didn't have a murder weapon. They didn't have DNA or other forensic evidence. What they did have were eyewitness accounts and circumstantial clues, and it was enough. The jury found him guilty of first-degree kidnapping. They couldn't all agree on a murder charge, but kidnapping alone got him 25 years to life. For the families of the other missing children, it was bittersweet. Sure, Rand was off the streets, but none of their kids' cases had been solved. It felt like there were still too many unanswered questions. Then, years later, in the early 2000s, detectives decided to take another hard look at one of those old cases. The 1981 disappearance of 7-year-old Hollyanne Hughes. This time, witnesses testified they'd actually seen Holly getting into Rand's car. Holly's mother told the court she recognised Rand's voice in a chilling ransom call she'd gotten days after her daughter vanished. A jailhouse informant even claimed Rand had bragged about killing her. In 2004, Rand was convicted of kidnapping Hollyanne Hughes and given another 25 years to life. Because his sentences were set to run one after the other, his first shot at parole wouldn't come until 2037, when he'd be 93 years old. When I think about the story of Andre Rand and the legend of Cropsey, what strikes me most is how folklore and reality sometimes overlap in unsettling ways. At first, Cropsey was just a cautionary tale. A boogeyman parents used to keep their kids close. You'd hear it at sleepovers or whispered on the playground, and everyone assumed it was just another scary story meant to keep us from wandering off. But when a real man's crimes began to mirror the legend, it blurred the line between myth and truth in a way that still feels deeply eerie. It's one thing to hear about a monster in the woods. It's another to realize that the monster is actually a person, someone who walks the same streets you do, someone who could pass you in a grocery store and you'd never know. That's the kind of thing that shakes a community's sense of safety to its core, because it forces you to accept that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't made up at all. They're flesh and blood, they look like anyone else, and they can live right down the street. It's also disturbing to see how many times Rand's name came up over the years without him being stopped for good. From the early 1970s onward, there were multiple disappearances where he was a suspect, and yet each time there wasn't enough evidence to lock him away permanently. That's not necessarily because the police weren't trying. Proving crimes like these without physical evidence is notoriously difficult, but the pattern is hard to ignore. Case after case, his name hovered around the edges, like smoke that you can smell but can't see. And it makes you wonder, how many opportunities were there to prevent another tragedy? How many lives could have been saved if the system had been able to act sooner? That's the frustrating, heartbreaking part of true crime. Sometimes the warnings are there, sometimes people suspect the truth, but without hard proof, nothing sticks. It's a reminder that justice often comes too late, and when it finally does, it's rarely enough to erase the pain that's already been done. Finally, this case really makes me think about how we process fear and danger as communities. The legend of Cropsey gave people a kind of shorthand for evil, a way to explain something they couldn't fully understand. It was a story that said, stay close, stay safe, because there's something out there that wants to harm you. But once Rand was arrested, the myth became tethered to a real face and name, and that changed everything. Staten Island could no longer dismiss Cropsey as just a bedtime scare. Now, it was part of their history. In a strange way, the legend had been warning people all along, even if no one realized it. And yet, even with Rand behind bars for the rest of his life, the story doesn't feel finished. Too many families still live without closure, without answers, without even a body to lay to rest.